She told me I was too old to understand. And she said it with a sharpness that cut deeper than anything I expected to hear from my own daughter. The words came fast, without hesitation, as if they had been sitting on her tongue for days, waiting for a chance to break free. For a moment, I didn't even react. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to understand how a child I raised could look at me like I was some burden from another time. Something in her eyes was wrong. Hollow, shaped by someone else's voice, rather than her own. I asked her what she meant, but she only sighed and said I wouldn't get it, that people my age held on to things that no longer mattered. The way she said it didn't sound like her. It sounded coached, practiced, like she was repeating a line someone had fed her. I felt confusion rising first, then hurt settling right behind it, heavy and slow. She used to come to me for guidance, but now she spoke to me like a stranger, giving instructions to another stranger. Every word carried a distance that felt forced, as if she needed it there to protect something. I noticed her partner standing behind her, not saying anything but watching me with a stare that felt far too confident. He didn't have to speak for me to know he had been filling her head with ideas that did not belong to her. The way she positioned herself, the way she waited for him to nod before finishing a sentence, all of it pointed to a truth I didn't want to face. Someone had convinced her that I was an obstacle, not a father. And beneath her sudden coldness, I sensed something even worse. Something financial, something planned, something hidden. While she dismissed me as too old to understand, she ignored the person who needed her most. My wife sat in the next room, confused by the raised voices and frightened by the tension she could not name. She depended on our daughter for patience and compassion, yet she was treated like an afterthought. That moment told me more than her harsh words ever could. It showed me how far my daughter had drifted from the values she once held. Her anger wasn't really about age or understanding. It was about control, about creating space where she could make decisions without being questioned. I walked away from that moment knowing something dangerous was unfolding. Her words were more than disrespect. They were a warning. Someone wanted me out of the way, and she was letting it happen. I didn't know the truth yet, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. It wasn't a daughter pulling back. It was the start of a plan, and I was standing in the middle of it without understanding why. What would you do if your child said you were too old to understand your life? I spent decades building a life for my family, brick by brick, often without pause or recognition. I worked long hours, sometimes through nights, to provide stability, a home where my daughter could grow safely, and a sense of security she could take for granted. I thought that providing was enough, that love expressed through effort and protection would carry its own meaning. But now, as I sit alone reflecting, I realize that effort, however constant, is invisible when someone chooses not to see it. She benefited from every sacrifice I made, her education, the house she grew up in, the business I started that allowed her to pursue opportunities without worry. Each choice I made, each risk I took, was aimed at giving her a life I never had. I never expected accolades or praise. I only wanted her to thrive. But the threads of gratitude I hoped would weave between us have frayed into something unrecognizable. Over time, I began noticing subtle changes in the way she recounted our history. Stories of childhood challenges were often told without acknowledging the support I gave. Moments where I guided or protected her were minimized, erased almost, replaced with narratives of independence I never opposed but helped enable. It was as if my presence and my work were edited out of the story she was now telling herself and others. At first, I brushed it off, assuming a child's memory shifts over time. Now, I see it as the first sign of a worldview being shaped by influences beyond my home. Small things that once went unnoticed began to surface. Requests for money framed as necessity rather than shared planning, dismissals of family advice as if experience were outdated, and moments when her tone shifted abruptly if I questioned any plan that involved financial commitments. These minor irregularities felt like tiny cracks in a dam, subtle yet meaningful, each one signaling an expectation I had not consented to, a boundary being tested without acknowledgement. It became clear that her perspective wasn't formed in isolation. There were outside influences guiding her understanding, suggesting that she could escape responsibility while still enjoying the benefits I provided. Decisions that once involved collaboration became declarations she assumed I would silently accept. Every step toward independence seemed calculated, not just to grow, but to distance herself from me while leveraging the life I had built. By the end of the evening, I understood something crucial. Her escape narrative didn't start last week or even last year. It began quietly, over time, through rewritings of history, subtle dismissals, and outside counsel shaping her sense of entitlement. The foundation I labored to create for her, a foundation of safety, trust, and support, was being repurposed into a path she walked without me, a path that ignored the sacrifices that made it possible. And in that realization, a heavy unease settled over me, heavier than any grief I had felt before. The first time I noticed the change, it was subtle, almost easy to miss. Her voice had shifted, no longer warm, no longer the natural cadence of a child speaking to her father. It was tight, clipped, each word measured as though she were afraid to say too much. I asked her how her day had gone, expecting the usual chatter. But she responded in a way that made me pause. Her sentences were short, almost rehearsed, carrying a tone that was distant and condescending. I tried to ignore it, telling myself she was busy or stressed. But something inside me refused to let it go. Then I heard him, or at least I sensed him. Her partner had begun guiding her responses, leaning close during phone calls, or prompting her in subtle ways when we spoke in person. I didn't catch it at first, only the after effects. The phrasing that sounded more like a script than a conversation, the way she echoed his thoughts back to me without realizing it. When I commented or offered advice, she snapped, accusing me of being controlling or not understanding the situation. Her words stung. "You don't get it," she said once. Another time, "You hold us back." I tried to respond calmly, but the frost in her tone was palpable, more dangerous than any argument. A friend noticed too. Linda, a neighbor who had watched my daughter grow up, mentioned in passing that she seemed distant, distracted, even uncomfortable when we spoke in public. She noticed the way her partner would answer questions for her or steer conversations away from topics I brought up. Hearing it from someone else, someone not invested in the tension, made the coldness feel real, undeniable. It wasn't just a phase or a mood. It was deliberate, influenced, shaped by someone else's agenda. The more I observed, the more I suspected a pattern tied to money and independence. Her sudden reluctance to discuss family finances, her evasive answers about support or gifts, and the careful avoidance of topics where I might assert influence all suggested she had been coached. Every conversation, even casual ones, carried the undertone of strategy. Her warmth was gone, replaced by caution and distance. And it was no longer just about age or misunderstanding. It was about control, and I was being edged out. By the end of that week, The confusion I initially felt had evolved into a quiet fear. The daughter I had raised, the one who once sought guidance, laughed freely, and confided in me, was becoming someone I didn't recognize. And with that recognition came grief. The sharp, hollow ache of seeing someone you love drift under the influence of another while you stand powerless to intervene. I realized then that this shift was not temporary. It was the first visible step in a path I would soon have to follow carefully to uncover the truth. I started by pulling up the bank statements, going back several months, trying to piece together a timeline I had ignored for too long. At first, everything looked normal. Payments for the mortgage, utilities, and routine bills. But as I scanned further, I noticed charges that didn't fit the usual pattern. Withdrawals labeled vaguely, deposits moved around without explanation, small transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. My heart sank, and a cold suspicion settled in. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I cross-referenced the dates with the messages and emails I had from my daughter. There were notes about covering expenses and handling payments that didn't match the timeline of her requests. In one email, I noticed the groom's name attached to a discussion about wedding planning expenses I hadn't been told about. It was subtle at first, a suggestion here, a reminder there. But together, it painted a picture I didn't want to see. They had planned for me to provide funds quietly while keeping me in the dark. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Her partner was not just present. He was orchestrating her actions. The language in the messages, the timing of requests, the careful avoidance of mentioning me, they all suggested deliberate manipulation. My resources were being used as if they were theirs to command. And I hadn't been asked. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief, knowing they had calculated every step to avoid accountability. I made an appointment with an accountant I trusted, someone familiar with my finances and who had helped me manage them for years. I laid out the statements and the communications, explaining the odd transfers and the patterns I had begun to see. She listened, silent at first, and then nodded slowly. "This is a common sign of elder financial exploitation," she said. "Someone is positioning themselves to use resources without consent and expects you not to notice. Documentation is key, but it's already happening." Her words hit me harder than any insult or argument ever could. I returned home that night and went over the records again, line by line. Each one seemed innocuous on its own, but together they were proof. Proof that my daughter's independence had been orchestrated to benefit her partner and shield them from my oversight. They had assumed I wouldn't see the pattern, that my trust would remain unchallenged. But I did see it. Every transfer, every request, every omission added up to the undeniable truth I had feared. By the end of the evening, I felt a weight settle over me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a lapse in communication. It was intentional. They had planned for me to provide silently, to remain ignorant while they built their future on my contributions. And seeing that clearly, with evidence in my hands, I knew the next steps couldn't be delayed. The first undeniable proof of their exploitation was in front of me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked into the lawyer's office carrying the folders of statements, emails, and receipts I had painstakingly collected. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with legal texts that smelled faintly of old paper and ink. And for the first time in weeks, I felt someone might finally understand. She greeted me without judgment and listened as I explained everything: the odd transfers, the messages, the groom's involvement, and the way my daughter had dismissed me as too old to understand. I watched her face carefully, searching for skepticism or doubt, but found none. She nodded, absorbing each detail as if it mattered. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and began walking me through what I was seeing. In plain language, she explained the differences between a gift, a loan, and unauthorized use of funds. She told me how power of attorney and informal financial expectations could be manipulated, especially when an elder's generosity is assumed rather than consented to. Every sentence landed with clarity. She didn't sugarcoat what I had experienced, nor did she minimize it because of my age. She simply called it what it was: exploitation. Her tone was calm, professional, and firm. She outlined steps I could take immediately, keeping detailed records of all communications, documenting every financial transfer, and drafting affidavits to confirm intent and involvement. She suggested creating a clear paper trail to protect my interests and to show any pattern of coercion or influence. As she spoke, I felt a weight lift, not because the situation had changed, but because someone finally validated what I had feared was true. She also explained how courts and financial institutions often view these situations. They look for documentation and evidence of intent, she said. And by gathering the facts carefully, I would have the ability to protect myself. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about making sure my rights and dignity were preserved. Hearing it confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't carelessness or youthful misunderstanding. It was a deliberate pattern, and it had been happening under my nose. I left the office feeling a mix of anger and resolve. Anger at the betrayal, at the deceit, at the realization that my daughter and her partner had counted on my silence. Resolve because I now had a path forward, concrete steps I could take to protect myself and my family. I was no longer adrift, no longer left to guess what was happening behind closed doors. The validation I received was profound. For the first time, I felt seen, not as an old man out of touch, but as someone whose contributions and rights mattered. The exploitation had been identified, the steps laid out, and the responsibility to act was mine. I had the facts, the support of a professional, and a new clarity that anger alone could not provide. What would you do if a lawyer confirmed your child was exploiting you? I found the first clear evidence late one night, sitting alone at the kitchen table under the harsh glow of the overhead light. The messages were small, almost innocuous when read separately. Lines about budgets, plans for the wedding, suggestions about who would cover which expenses. But together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Her partner's name appeared again and again, linked to instructions on how to handle payments and conversations with vendors. There was one message that made my chest tighten. Make sure he doesn't realize we already have it covered. Let him think it's his idea. The betrayal hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. I dug deeper, reviewing bank statements and email chains. Every transfer I had made, every payment I had quietly handled, was there. But alongside them were notes and reminders showing that my daughter had been coached to act as if she were fully independent. She had repeated phrases I recognized immediately from the partner, words that I knew were not hers, phrased to shift responsibility and mask the truth. It was subtle, but deliberate, a manipulation designed to exploit my generosity while keeping me unaware. When I finally confronted her, I did so with calm precision, laying out the evidence piece by piece. I showed her the messages, the emails, the financial records. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply placed the facts between us and waited for her to respond. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, almost mechanically, she began repeating the phrases I had seen before, the very lines she had been coached to use. We're trying to be independent. He thinks it's best if we handle it ourselves, she said, her voice tight, rehearsed, lacking any real emotion. Hearing it come from her mouth, knowing she had chosen to say them, cut deeper than any argument ever could. I realized in that moment that she had not been manipulated entirely. She had aligned herself willingly, choosing the convenience of keeping the money flowing and the appearances clean over honesty and family. Her actions were calculated, intentional, and deeply hurtful. The child I thought I knew had made a choice, and that choice was not me, not our family, but a path that served her comfort and the partner's interests. By the end of the conversation, the truth was undeniable. My generosity had been weaponized. My trust had been twisted into a tool for someone else's plan. And as I left that evening, exhausted and heavy-hearted, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I finally understood the full scope of what had happened, and with understanding came the first spark of control. I would no longer be silent, no longer used, and no longer overlooked. The lie had cracked open, and I could see the reality in full. The morning of the event arrived, and I stayed home, watching the sunlight fall across the empty living room. She was somewhere else, preparing to step into a world I had helped build. Yet I was not invited, not acknowledged, not considered. The thought hit harder than I expected. The life I had worked to create, the safety and stability I had provided, now carried her forward without me. I felt the familiar ache of grief, heavy and slow, settling over my chest as I imagined her smiling in a dress I had paid for and a future I had helped secure. Before the day had fully begun, my phone rang. It was the venue, polite but firm, asking questions about payments that had not yet been authorized or were now exceeding the arrangements I had made. My heart sank as I realized they were treating me as responsible for matters I had no control over. Each word from the coordinator underscored how deeply my contributions had been hidden, misrepresented, and taken for granted. I quickly gave them my lawyer's contact, keeping my own words minimal, letting professional authority stand in my place. Later, my lawyer called with updates, explaining that formal notices and protective orders were being issued to clarify responsibility and prevent any further misappropriation of funds. The process was slow, meticulous, and entirely necessary. I listened as she outlined the steps and understood that my role now was to uphold the truth and enforce the boundaries I had set. There was no comfort in it, only a growing clarity and a sense of moral vindication. What had been taken from me would not be ignored or erased. By the afternoon, the repercussions began to ripple outward. My daughter called, her voice trembling and defensive. She questioned why the venue had contacted me, clearly unsettled that her plan to keep my involvement secret was unraveling. Her partner, too, made calls, attempting to control the narrative, their panic palpable despite the composure they tried to maintain. Every attempt to redirect blame only highlighted their miscalculations and exposed the deliberate exploitation of my trust. I stayed firm, refusing to erase or soften the consequences. This was not about punishment, but about accountability. I had already been sidelined, dismissed, and used. Allowing them to continue unchecked would mean condoning the behavior that had caused the breach of trust. I would not do it. Standing at the edge of my living room, I felt the weight of what had transpired, the grief of absence, but also the quiet satisfaction that truth and responsibility were being acknowledged. By evening, the paper trail had laid everything bare. There was no argument left that could hide the facts. The work I had done, the support I had given, and the exploitation I had endured were all documented. I felt a somber clarity, a confirmation that my efforts to protect myself and my family were necessary and justified. The future she built without me had consequences, and for once, those consequences were visible to her and the world. I have spent countless nights reflecting on what happened, trying to understand how the daughter I raised could so easily dismiss the very hands that built her world. Betrayal, I have learned, does not come from circumstance. It comes from character. Her choices, shaped by outside influence and self-interest, revealed more about her values than any single argument or disagreement ever could. It was not about my age or my understanding. It was about the decisions she made when she thought no one was watching. Supporting an adult child has its limits, and I had to confront them. My love and care had boundaries, though I had blurred them for decades out of trust and hope. Support should never demand the erasure of one's dignity. It should not cost peace of mind, emotional stability, or the ability to remain a parent with a voice. I had given everything I could, quietly and without expectation. Yet it was treated as something to exploit rather than appreciate. That realization stung more than any harsh word. I began setting the boundaries I had neglected for too long. Financial ones first, locking accounts, keeping detailed records, and refusing any requests without transparency and proper documentation. Emotional boundaries followed. I would engage, but I would not be manipulated or drawn into guilt. And legal boundaries, the step I once resisted, became a shield, a necessary structure to preserve my rights and my dignity. For the first time, I felt the alignment of protection and principle. Strength was no longer passive, but active. Grief remained, persistent and heavy. I mourned the daughter I thought I had, the one who once trusted me completely and carried our family's values in her heart. That loss was not something to be erased or dismissed. It was real, and it hurt. Yet within that grief, I found clarity. The person I loved had made choices, and those choices were hers. They did not diminish what I had built or the integrity with which I had built it. I realized that acceptance did not require forgiveness or reunion. It required acknowledgement of reality and a commitment to self-respect. As I reflect on everything, one question remains, echoing in the quiet of my home. Should age ever be used as a weapon against the very person who built your foundation? I do not have an answer, but I leave it for the mind and conscience of anyone listening to weigh. I can only ensure that I am no longer silent, no longer complicit, and no longer vulnerable to exploitation disguised as familial obligation. My world remains intact because I finally drew the line, and I carry my dignity with the certainty that it cannot be taken again.